I'm going to hand over very shortly to Jack Dromey, who's going to chair our first panel. Just before we do that, we'd like to acknowledge the support of our partner organisations who've supported this conference. That's Unison, the GMB, Labour Coast and Country, Progress, Labour Future, and the Labour Campaign for Devolution. The first panel this morning is going to try to explore the challenge for devolution. What exactly is the problem that we're trying to solve? I'm going to hand over to Jack Dromey, MP, who's going to chair this panel. Jack.
Good morning. Thank you very much, John and Rachel. As the proud son of Irish parents, my dad came from County Cork as a navvy to dig roads, and my mother came from County Tipperary to train as a nurse in a London hospital. Why am I a strong supporter of the work of the English Labour Network and the work, John, that you have led so admirably over many years? This is a challenging, often uncomfortable debate. And can I just tell two stories very briefly? The first was back in 2016. I was asked to run the Stoke by-election. It looked bleak to start with. Paul Nuttall was leading a resurgence of UKIP. And what we did was to analyse what is Stoke. And what was absolutely clear was it was the notion of pride in country, pride in city, pride in the flag. And therefore what we did was to take on xenophobic populism. And instead we ran a campaign which was based upon progressive patriotism. We cloaked ourselves in the flag, and absolutely rightly so. And I strongly believe that we should never cede the ground of patriotism to the right. There were gasps at the time when we went down that path, but I think the heresy, as it was at one stage, has become increasingly the orthodoxy, but this is a very difficult debate going forward. And then secondly, at the following Labour Party conference, after the Stoke by-election, I remember, I think, John, you were there, Gareth, who was our candidate in Stoke, Ruth Snell, were on the platform, 200 people in the audience. And it was a debate on identity. And there was palpable discomfort when it came to the talk of English identity. And I remember I asked the audience some questions. I said, how many of you here would describe yourself as Irish? I'd say about 1 in 3 put their hand up. How many Welsh? How many Scottish? How many British? And when it then came to how many of you would describe yourself as English, I think there was half a dozen hands went up. And I remember saying at the time, I don't believe you. Why is it that we are comfortable talking about English identity, Scottish identity, Welsh identity, Irish identity, but somehow we shy away from the notion of English identity? And that is wrong. And it's a view that we have to challenge. But then crucially is, what does that all mean? How do we tackle, obviously, some of the cultural problems, but what does a new settlement for Great Britain, and in particular, empowering England, mean? And that's why the convention that John referred to is so important. Now, today, we are focused on English devolution. What's the problem we're trying to solve in the session that we're going into now? And then principles of reform going forward at the next stages. We have 3 excellent speakers. We've asked them to address a range of issues, the centralisation of government policy affecting the ability to meet local needs, what are the issues that arise, Devo deals, the consequences of for England of the pandemic, and do the public trust local leaders to exercise more power? So a range of issues that we've asked them to address. So straight into our 3 excellent speakers. The first is Jamie Driscoll, who's the Metro Mayor for North Tyneside. I think, Jamie, now since 2019. Welcome, and we look forward to hearing from you. Jamie.
Thanks, Jack. And it's a very common mistake where it's the Metro Mayor of the North of Tyne, which shows how far we've got to go with devolution. North Tyneside's a local authority. The North of Tyne is the city region, and it's only half of the city region because that's the mess we are with English devolution. So that was a wonderful introduction. When we talk about constitutional reform, there's 2 questions that socialists should ask. What do we want to deliver? and reform in whose interests. Notably, both were largely missing from the Brexit debate. It was all about who we don't like. And we've got to keep that element of it out of this debate, or as a nation we'll make the same mistakes. So what do we want to deliver? For me, economic democracy, in whose interests people of ordinary means. And it's undeniably true that class differences in wealth and power are huge. Differences within cities are vast, but the spatial imbalances of power and wealth are real. There's many stats about the consequences of inequality. Rachel gave some, but the underlying statistic is this. In the Northeast, GDP per capita is just 73% of the UK average. That affects our public services, our transport, our job prospects, even our lifespan. And it wasn't always this way. For a century, from 1871 to 1981, 110 years, we hovered at about 93% of GDP per capita. Then it started falling through the Thatcher years, through the New Labour years, through the coalition and austerity, and we're now at 73% of GDP per capita. Where British working people have suffered, we've suffered more. Since 1981, there's been 51 government initiatives to restore regional growth. Local enterprise partnerships, RDAs, enterprise zones, all sorts of things. None has solved the problem. And the problem is a lack of investment, public and private. 54% of venture capital in this country goes to London, 3% comes to the Northeast. Culture and arts economy, £311 per capita in London, £72 per capita in the Northeast. We have the lowest rate of business startups, scale up, business density, life expectancy, if you're poor in the Northeast, is 5 years lower than if you're poor in London. And let's be really clear, this is not the fault of the people of London. I want London to have more devolution and more fiscal independence. And Sadiq and I have discussed this and we're in agreement. The fiscal devolution is the route we have to take. Our analysis in the Northeast shows that borrowing just 500 million for a regional wealth fund would create 14,000 good jobs and allow the local state to own equity shares in growing businesses. It will pay for itself, even under the current economic model. And we should have the powers to borrow at base rate. Land value capture is another one. It means the public purse benefiting from public investment. In the north of Tyne, we're reopening the Ashington-Blythe-Newcastle railway line. It'll cost around 162 million. The land value will increase by at least that much. All that increase in wealth goes to landowners. A charge on the increase in the value would mean that when the land's sold, the increase attributable to public investment is repaid. That would allow us to borrow upfront to fund infrastructure, creating jobs, tackling climate change, and tackling regional imbalances in investment. England's not unified, and it can't be unified on a lot of areas. The economy that I represent has more in common with Wales than with Surrey. We're physically closer to Holyrood than to Westminster. I'm working with Scottish government to persuade Westminster to upgrade the East Coast Main Line because it's in our joint interests. So that's why I'm in favour of devolution to the level of the functional economic area. For us, that's the city region. It may vary around different parts of England. I don't claim to be an expert of anything other than the Northeast. So I'm opposed to the idea of an English executive or an English parliament. Subnational bodies, such as the Northern Powerhouse, they should be confederal, where city regions choose to collaborate. Through convening and limited investment powers, the north of Tyne has already, as Jack said, I've only been in post for 20 months, we've created 3,200 jobs, smashing the target government gave us by a factor of 5. We've embedded our good work pledge into every contract we make. That commits employers to ending insecure work, such as 0 hours. They must pay the real living wage, not just the legal minimum. They must recognise trade unions, have in-work progression, maintain TUC good standards of work. And the end game of devolution should be the total place outcome, where all decisions are made at the most local level suitable, not just at the city region. That involves national and ideally global redistribution, of course. We are an internationalist party, with the object of sustainably raising wealth and well-being for everyone everywhere. Functional economic areas should get to design, co-design social and physical infrastructure projects with national departments, not have decisions made for us by people who aren't us. The current government's not going to allow total place, we know that, but we should have control of the regional transport system, a regional wealth fund, and land value uplift powers, all under democratic control. We already have city region mayors in place across much of England, hopefully Tracy across Wicker soon. We're in our early days. We've seen people identify with them, certainly not the end point of devolution, but it is a start and something to build on. And English metro mayors aren't like US mayors. Our powers are limited. A more accurate term would actually be directly elected regional convener. We need to devolve more genuine economic power to city region mayors for the simple reason that there are very few one-size-fits-all policies that work for London and Newcastle, or Canterbury and Durham for that matter. The Tories have got their messaging right on this. They talk of levelling up. Whether they deliver is a very different question. When push came to shove, they hung us out to dry with a lower rate of furlough when the northern regions were being pushed into tier 3 until the northern mayors fought back and eventually won. And we know that the people in our region see this. The sense of homeland is a strong part of identity, but here it's not the White Cliffs of Dover, it's the Angel of the North.
Thank you very much, Jamie, and congratulations on the remarkable progress that you have made since being elected in the most difficult of circumstances, with inspiring Labour leadership using your leverage to achieve both jobs, but also to tackle the notion of good work. So very, very well done. The next speaker, as I've got a friend, Tracy. Tracy was the member, or is the Member of Parliament for Batley and Spen. Was outstanding as the Shadow Minister for Early Years, a champion of early years, and she is our candidate for the Mayor of West Yorkshire. Warm welcome, Tracy. Can you now address the conference?
What an absolute pleasure to be here, and fantastic to follow Jamie, and I'm absolutely in awe of what he's achieved in that short amount of time. And there's no such thing as a good idea from someone else, so I'm happy to take all his good ideas and all the other mayoral good ideas and put them into my manifesto too. He is a real inspiration for his community and for me too. So to be the Labour mayoral candidate for West Yorkshire is a huge privilege. It's where I was born and raised. So to represent my region and my party and hopefully deliver our values in power is a responsibility, but something I'm absolutely up for. Obviously, it doesn't escape me that if I am elected, along with Jessie Jo Jacobs in the Tees Valley, we could be the first ever women metro mayors in the country. And as we're in the midst of campaigning, I must say, and it would be remiss of me not to, say, please join us on the phone banks. We're doing them almost every night, so get on dialogue with us. So today's debate is critical, and in the North it takes on a lot of significance, particularly in how people have felt through the pandemic. We talk a lot, don't we, about communities that feel left behind, that are detached from and mistrust Westminster, and I believe devolution can be an antidote to that. But I will say, when I told colleagues I was standing for mayor, which would inevitably mean standing down for Parliament, there were some who expressed surprise that I'd choose to go into local politics over and above Westminster. And there is the problem, that many just don't get the fantastic possibilities of a mayor to actually get things done and change people's lives, to set the political weather. And after 5 years in opposition, I am very alive to the frustration of not being able to do as much as I'd like to materially change the lives of the people who voted me in. But being a mayor will allow me to do so much more. But as Michael Heseltine said recently, and while I don't always agree with his politics, I do agree with his comment here, progress to devolving power to the English nations has stalled because people in power in London are clinging on to past structures that suit their careers, their experience and their way of working. So with no leadership from the Tories, we know the Devo and local recovery white paper seems stuck in COVID weeds. It is down to Labour to lead, and I'm really excited that Keir and Rachel and Labour is now driving that agenda. And haven't we seen from our northern mayors, Andy Burnham and also Jamie, how having a mayor can make a material difference to people's everyday lives. Northern mayors standing up with northern voices, speaking out for our communities. It was a game changer last year, and it's why the mayor's intervention was so powerful, because the mayors had earned the trust of the people they represent. But too often when we talk about devolution and mayors and on the phones, I really feel it. it feels like a wonkish, opaque, secondary level of bureaucracy that won't make any difference to the lives of the people the mayor is there to serve. But for me, nothing could be further from the truth. Putting power in the hands of local people can only be a force for good. And we must call out the cynical way government talk about empowering communities whilst not giving the mayors the resources to achieve anything. Of course, we know, as Jamie just described, for mayors, not everything costs money. The mayor has extensive soft powers of convening and persuasion. I plan to, as Jamie has, and Andy and others, to introduce a Fair Work Commission to improve the quality of work in West Yorkshire, bring inward investment, stimulate new economies, implement and drive a domestic abuse charter with support for the victims and survivors of domestic violence, lead on our journey to net zero carbon by 2038. But real change costs. And while 38 million a year for 10 years, negotiated by our excellent council leaders in West Yorkshire, it sounds like a huge amount of money, but it cannot be seen as the end. The end. It has to be the beginning. It has to be the floor, not the ceiling. And I certainly will not be behind the door in asking for our fair share, because if we want to deliver a mass transit system that's green and clean, we need the funding to do it. If skills and lifelong learning are to be at the heart of our COVID recovery plan, we need the resources to deliver world-class training. If we want police on our streets, genuine community policing, we can't do that without the money. Green homes fit for purpose at the right place, the right price, cannot be built on a shoestring. And of course, I understand there's always that push and pull between regional and central government. For example, I will fight to my last breath for a national NHS fully funded and accessible to every person in our nation. But within that, we have seen, haven't we, with the rollout of testing in our communities, the delivery of the vaccine, I'll be making the case that local authorities should be able to make decisions about where best those resources should go to be most effective. Every person in the UK should have the right to free education, but locally we know where we need to develop and deliver adult skills to improve lives and drive the local economy. So for me, devolution is about trust, being able to make the right choices for local people, with local people, because we know our communities, we understand our local areas. It is a race to the top, not a race to the bottom, with all our regions and nations working in cooperation. Labour mayors working together, trusted by the public, will be a phenomenal force for good and a powerful advert for what Labour could do in government nationally. Speaking truth to power to get the resources we need to flourish. Having regional empowered Labour mayors really, really matters. And it will be a huge honour in May to be able to count myself as one of them. Thanks, Jack.
Well, thank you very much, Tracy. An inspiring contribution. And as you said right at the start, why are we Labour? We want to make a difference in the country that we live and the community that we live. We want power, but we want to devolve power. We want to change things for the better. And like Jamie, an inspiring prospectus about what is possible. And just one final point is that through what we do locally and regionally, what we demonstrate is what we're capable of nationally, a Labour government in power. The third speaker, before I go into the third speaker, is if you've not already done so and you want to submit a question, please do so on the chat, and we'll then get in as many as we can. The third speaker is Naushabah Khan. It's a Labour councillor for Gillingham South on Medway Council, the former candidate for Rochester and Stroud against Mark Reckless. I know what it's like having taken on Paul Nuttall. So very, very welcome. We will look forward to hearing from you now.
Thank you very much, Jack. And can I just say a big thank you to the English Labour Network for setting up this conference. I think it's absolutely having the right conversation at the right time. And I have to admit, I'm slightly envious of my panellists who have so much more power than I do as a backbench councillor in Kent, in a unitary authority in Medway. I think there is a huge amount to be said. I think, again, it's just a reflection of how there is this huge inequality across our country when it comes to devolution, and how different people are able to deliver for their communities. The title of the session is What's the Problem We Are Trying to Solve? And for me, as a Labour politician, as a campaigner, it really is one about the left behind communities that I represent. And it's people who I feel that regardless of which political party is in power, have always felt that they don't benefit from, the big changes that national government will bring forward. They have felt left behind. And for me, it's also about those growing inequalities that I've seen in the area that I represent, and I'm sure colleagues have also seen, and I know Rachel talked about it earlier in her speech. If we take Medway as an example, I think Medway is a very good example of the types of areas that we really need, that devolution could really help to change, where local leadership can play a big, big role, and where there is that need to have people making decisions who understand their communities, who know who know exactly how to make this right. So Medway is a town where I grew up, and I represented it as a local councillor, and it's got huge problems of inequality. They've manifested themselves in the population over time, and I think to kind of understand where that comes from, it's helpful to understand Medway's recent history as well. So Medway is an area made up of a number of towns that had strong military history and culture, and up until the 80s, the largest employer was the dockyard, and that was closed down by a Tory government, and it was closed down overnight, leaving a complete generation unemployed, and it left them wondering what their future looked like. Now, Medway's recovery since then has been, I would say, stilted, because yes, there has been investment. There was investment under a Labour government which brought universities to the towns. The biggest employer now is the council. It's a very different type of skill, it's a very different type of job, and it speaks to a very different type of community. We also see businesses coming forward in Medway, which is great, and there's a growing arts and creative industry which is growing here as well. But our growth is still, because of our geography, largely linked to London. We've become a commuter town, so we have commuter towns actually. So we have a number of people travelling in and out of the city every day, and we are our house prices are still relatively low, so we see people coming and moving here because they can afford to live here in a way they might not be able to in London. But again, the growth and change we see is very much linked to what's happening in the capital. And as a result, some of the changes that we've seen at national government level in funding have had huge impacts on us. Austerity has had a really big impact on our council, and that has been added to by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has really started to show those inequalities. I mean, you can travel from one end of Medway to the other and lose 7 years in life expectancy. That shows you the types of the struggle that we have in being able to address inequality here. So even before the pandemic, we had these challenges, and I think we had the challenge of huge chunks of our community feeling disenfranchised. And often that is linked with a sense of identity. And I know, Jack, you talked about it at the start, and it perhaps is a different topic for another day, but it probably doesn't surprise people to hear that 70% of people in my ward voted to leave the European Union. And I think there is that sense of feeling left behind that still exists within our community, and we haven't quite worked out how to address that. The council is struggling, so we recently passed our budget, and that required us to dip into our reserves in a big way. And we are still struggling with delivering housing, tackling homelessness, and really being able to generate business growth in the area. All of that comes down to devolution, because I think the ability to make those decisions at a local level could really allow us to make that difference for our communities. Jamie, as you talked about fiscal devolution, I think that's absolutely right. I think that is how we can really start to get control of this, and also to make those decisions that matter for our communities who for so long feel that they just haven't been able to have a say, and that what happens at a national government level just isn't really giving them the type of support and future that they think they deserve. So my concern with this, though, is that I don't think this is absolutely the right time to be having a discussion. That's correct. But I just don't think that either party has come up with a solution that works. So it was really good to hear Rachel earlier talking about some of the things that Keir wants to do, because I think that is absolutely right. The Tories originally had a plan for just looking at local government reform, my fear with that is that it is largely delivered by financial strains. They are looking at ways that they can deliver local government on the cheap. And that's not going to provide the right answers, certainly not in places like Kent and Medway, where we have huge challenges that we need to address. And for me, it just was not the right response to the problem that we currently have. I think with Labour, it's, as I said, it's very good to hear that Keir and Rachel talking about the fact that this is now being taken seriously, that we want to come up with these solutions, that we understand and recognise that power cannot simply sit in Westminster. I think Labour's problem is, and Jack, I know you touched on this earlier on, is that often when we talk about England, and particularly when we start to talk about devolution, we often will link it with patriotism. And there is a link there. There is a link around identity. There is a link around patriotism, but we're very uncomfortable talking about that. Yeah. And when it comes to patriotism, I think we often, as a Labour Party, overthink it. The reality is people do not necessarily see us as a patriotic party. They just don't. The answer to that is not to come up with lots and lots of policy solutions or to come up with mugs or a bank holiday on St. George's Day. It's about real systematic change. And it's about looking at how our communities respond to us. And I think Labour in the past has failed to do that. And we really have to come up with a way that this works for our communities, which is why the plans and ideas under the current administration and under Keir are, I think, the right answer. I think we really need to understand, though, how different parts of the country are in different places. So we don't have a Metro Mayor here. We need to look at how far behind we are. So I absolutely agree with further powers, but those further powers has to be delivered through a very clear strategy, and they have to be delivered looking at England as a whole. And they also have to really consider the different types of communities and the different histories of the communities that we represent. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Naushabah. Now I'm having to operate off my mobile phone because my laptop is not working. We're going to go straight into questions. Before I do, can I thank you very much for your contribution? As a young national officer of the Transport and General Workers Union, I was involved in the battle against the closure of Chatham Dockyard. And I remember how devastating the impact of that was on the community. It took years for the community to start to recover. But one other thing about your inspiring contribution is Neil Kinnock, at a meeting of the Shadow Cabinet back in 1983, when things looked bleak beyond despair for the Labour Party, tells a story about how one member of the Shadow Cabinet, he never mentions who it was, said that Kent is gone. We are starting with F in Kent. Thanks to people like you rebuilding over the years, street by street, community by community, constituency by constituency, in 1997, Labour won, what was it, 8 or 9 seats in Kent. So the leadership that you give in often difficult circumstances, I think, is deeply appreciated. Now, the first question is, and I'll take each of the panelists if I can, please. Very good question. What's the problem we're trying to solve? Is it an economic issue where we need more local power to be effective? Or is it about connecting people's identity with power? Tracy, can I take you first?
Yeah, I don't think it's actually either or. I think it's absolutely about our individual identity, and certainly Jamie will have a vision of his region and their sense of identity. And certainly the focus groups we've been doing prior to the election, there is a real sense of pride coming from Yorkshire, and that sense of who we are, what our values are, you know, our commitment to our region and to our family. But to be effective, of course, we need more local powers. And what's quite frustrating is that around the country, the devolution deals are quite different. So, for example, Andy has oversight of health. Some mayors don't have policing. I think that we would all be helped, I think, by some sort of package that actually looks at an equivalence, and to make sure that those powers are given to each mayor, if the regions want them, that they can have those powers. I think, as I said in my opening statements, that I think the way that we go forward is having more oversight of financial control and financial autonomy in order to make those decisions. And certainly, as we've just heard in Medway and Kent, the idea that you have to dip into your reserves in order to survive COVID, when actually you've been promised by government the money, whatever it takes to get through this pandemic, and yet now you're having to dip into reserves. I think Jamie's ideas are very interesting as well, about the idea that if your land value rises, then you could, those developers and the people that benefit from that then contribute to their communities. But I think more than anything is trying to get people alive to the fact that they have also power over their own lives. And I have certainly seen, as the MP for 5 years for towns and villages, this north-south divide is genuine and palpable, but it's also a town and city divide. But actually within our towns and villages, there's also a divide there as well, between people for whom they feel life happens to them and they don't have control over their own destiny. And I think it is about the powers of the mayor, of course, but it's also about empowering our own communities in the way that we've just heard about getting involved in your community and trying to turn things around street by street. Certainly that's where Labour flourishes, and that's where Labour really does shine in our local councillors. And it's something that I certainly want to do as mayor, is to have a councillor, but like a backbench committee where I can plug in to my councillors who are doing really brilliant work in their wards that sometimes you don't hear about because you're working at a particular level with leaders. So I think it is about having more powers and more control over our destiny, but also it is about empowering people to use their sense of identity in a positive way, to be engaged, to understand that working with others, they can make life better for their communities. So I'm not sure whether I've absolutely answered that question in clarity, but for me, it's really important that this isn't the end, that we do go further. We do really certainly using the unity of these northern mayors to get into the room where it happens. Anybody who knows that Hamilton song, we need to be in the room where it happens, to make that case that things cannot be decided about us without us.
Thanks, Tracy. Jamie.
Thanks, Jack. Yeah, Tracy's covered so much that I'll pick up the other things. The question, is this about economics versus identity? And I think they're very different. One is about politics and one is about government. And we often confuse the two. We've got to be in government to do things. I am in government in a limited form. And a lot of this debate that's been happening in the party is how do we win? But let's not let how we win necessarily determine what we want to do. Because for me, the issue is about economics. It is about, and economics is, when you're going to die, can you get an appointment at your GP? Is your school getting properly funded? All of these things ultimately are economic questions, because we all know they're about spending money, and they're about where the decisions get to be made and are the policies tailored for the communities they're facing. So that's the problem we're trying to solve, because what works in central London doesn't work in Cornwall, never mind the northeast. So Tracy was talking about divisions in towns and cities. It's interesting that the ward with the highest instance of multiple deprivations in the whole of the north of Tyne is Byker, and that is right next to the city centre. It's just out of the city centre. We have towns that are, there's poverty in them, there's still pockets of poverty, but towns like Alnwick, where the Duke of Northumberland lives in a massive castle, and wealthy or more affluent commuter belt towns like Hexham, but we have left behind coalfield towns like Blyth and Ashington. And the difference in all of these is, do the people own any assets? If you're in a town or a ward where, in a city where people they own their own homes and they have financial assets and they have large private pensions and they own shares, That's the difference. And it was always thus. The reason these coalfield towns are poor is because the people who worked there, when they had work, money was coming in, but they never owned the houses, they never owned the mines. And that's ultimately what we've got to change, is so that people have financial resilience. Because when people have financial resilience, the social problems, the health problems start to dissipate. And that's exactly what Nasha was talking about when the issues about COVID causing problems in local communities. Those who had no financial reserves have suffered. Those who had financial reserves have weathered it all right. So it is an economic problem, and I really think it can only be devolved at the level, settled at the level of the functional economic area. We use city region as a shorthand. It's not really city region, actually. It is the economic hinterland, the travel to work area. That includes the towns. And that means getting away perhaps from agglomeration economics, where we invested in city centres, hoping we would have not trickle down, but trickle out. And it hasn't worked, and it doesn't work. So we've got to fix that. But again, that can only be fixed in that dynamic between the towns and the cities, which is why it should be the functional economic area. And there are parts of England where you don't have a large city with satellite towns, in which case we need a different approach. You might not need metro mayors, but we will still need devolution to the functional economic area.
Thank you, Jamie. Nasha.
Thank you, and apologies for the slightly interesting purple light I currently have going through my face. I haven't quite worked that one out yet. I certainly prefer doing this in person rather than over Zoom. I think, Jamie, it might sound a bit like I'm about to disagree with you, but I'm not sure I am. But for me, I feel like the two are linked almost inextricably. So I think the answers really come through the economics, but I think often linked to this, certainly where I live here in Medway, I have seen that identity is very much those people who have said, as I talked about earlier, felt that they've been left behind. That's where some of their questions around identity have also cropped up. So I've often noted that when we talk about, when we take, for example, the referendum, and how people chose to vote there, I remember having a number of conversations on the doorstep where people felt that where the economics hadn't been working for them, that is where they started to question lots of things around identity, around whether we need to be, whether we should be part of the European Union, whether that's to do with the other, whether that's to do with people from different races, from different backgrounds, whether migration is the problem. And a lot of that came from feeling like they've never had a piece of the pie. And I think that's perhaps where a Labour government didn't always get things right, because things changed at a great scale and globalisation became something that we very much bought into. But actually there was these communities that just felt things were changing very quickly, but never really felt like they were getting any benefit from that. So when we were trying to have the conversation around the referendum or around our membership of the European Union, I was saying to people, well, look at all these great benefits we get. And they were like, but we don't see those. We don't see those great benefits that you talk about. Actually, what we see is this, that my son or daughter still can't buy a house and probably won't ever be able to afford one. And they're now in their 30s and they're still living with me. And actually, we see that as a sign that they're doing worse than we were when we were that age. I still have children who don't have jobs, or they're in low employment. They're working 3 or 4 jobs and they're still not being able to make ends meet, or they're working on 0-hour contracts. And I know there was certainly this link around what it meant and our ability to have more autonomy as a country. And I think this is part of the conversation that we're having now about whereas that debate was about us as a country, now it's about us as a region, as an area, and our ability to be able to ensure that people do have a piece of that pie, because that's where they feel they're missing out. And I think the coronavirus pandemic has really highlighted that. You know, as I said earlier in my speech, if you travel from one end of Medway to the other, you can lose 7 years in your life expectancy. That's within one local authority. That is a shocking figure and a shocking statistic. And I think that's where we have a real challenge. And I just don't feel that at a national level that can be addressed, and which is why devolution is so important. However, I do think that those things are linked. You know, people see their connection to their local area, they see their connection to their country, and often they will see their kind of how they respond to the wider community as well, based on often their economic position. And that's certainly something I've seen in an area that is also predominantly white working class, even though it has changed over the years, and we are seeing a sort of change in terms of our demographics. Actually, that's the feedback that we get in this community. So for me, those two things are linked. I think we can have a better conversation around identity if we can get the economics of this right. And I think we could potentially better understand those issues. And I look back to the union movement as well on this, because there was a time when, you know, when we were campaigning hard on union rights and workers' rights, when there wasn't this issue in the 60s and 70s around race also playing a part into that, into the other playing a part, saying, well, this person comes from this community, why have they got a better deal than us? That didn't necessarily exist in the same way that perhaps sometimes those conversations exist now. And that's because everybody felt that they had those rights at work, or that there was a fight that was happening for their rights at work. I feel like we don't have those conversations in the same way anymore. So there is this idea that somehow a sense of inequality can manifest itself, a sense of difference can manifest itself, and people start to place some of those frustrations onto identity politics.
Well, I think Jack's trying to, I'm guessing, to get back on. So just, I think we are in agreement then, Nasha, that a lot of the things that you're talking about, exactly, everybody, I think, recognises that journey of people feeling left behind, seeing these images of success that they're not feeling part of, the worry about what's going to happen to their kids and so on. And I think they are, of course, economic questions that have led to that. And I think we need to be finding ways to address them. The one size fits all doesn't work. And identity itself, of course, is multifaceted. We all have multiple identities. You know, we have, even within cities, you know, you only have to go to not perhaps in the north of Tyne. Different football clubs, though, in the same city, people identify around that. You're going to have to deal with that, Tracy, when you're elected.
But also, what I was just to pick up on something about the changing nature of our communities, that I think COVID has also thrown up the changes that young people, particularly who felt they needed to leave to fulfill their potential, are now coming back because of economics, back to communities they left when they were 18 or 21, and bringing all those skills with them and that desire, that entrepreneurship, those ideas for innovation, that actually as mayors, that we have an opportunity to now say, we are at a turning point in our identity, that actually this can be an amazing place to live and work. You don't have to leave your town to fulfill your potential. You can have a great, highly skilled job, pay less in rent, have more in your pocket to spend, and be able to, for example, go to the coast at the weekend, or go hiking in the on the moors, or whatever it is that you enjoy. So we have an opportunity now to rebalance the idea that all the talent leaves our towns and villages for the city or for the south, and say, you know, actually we are open, and lots of young people are now coming back. And also, just to pick up the idea that the economics and the power and the identity, that when so many people have only £100 in savings, and we've seen the Resolution Foundation, their recent survey saying most people have drawn down on those savings, 220,000 people since October 2020 now in destitution, living in destitution. And you know, the economic argument is really powerful to be the advocate for that community, but also the community that comes with those skills, to bring those highly skilled, well-paid jobs back to our community. So it can't be a tale of two countries in our community. We have to be in it for absolutely everyone.
Fine, thank you.
Maybe having, oh, Jack, are you there?
Yes, I am. Yes, my apologies. Now, one final question in the time we've got left. It's an interesting one. We all want to devolve more power to Labour councils or Labour metro mayors, but would we feel comfortable devolving those powers to areas with long-term Tory rule? Are we all being consistent, is the question.
I mean, I don't know if you want me to pick up on that first, Jack, as somebody who
yes, please. Yeah.
is a backbench councillor in a Conservative-led authority, which has been as such for 20 years now. It's deeply frustrating. I think my answer to that is, yes, we are being consistent. I think for me, this isn't necessarily about party politics per se. It is about really having structures in place that allow us to have a better functioning local government and better functioning ability to serve our communities. And yes, I don't necessarily agree with any of the decisions that the leadership of my council make, but I do also recognise the frustrations that they also have when it comes to trying to deal with some of these challenging circumstances that we face. And I gave the example earlier, and I know Tracy picked up on it as well, of having to dip into reserves in order to make our budget whole up this year. And the question mark that was constantly being said by our finance officer was simply saying, well, we're just waiting to hear back from government. You know, we're just waiting to hear about how we will be able to, we're hoping they'll give us a package. That's what we've built into the budget. That's not a way to be able to efficiently run a local authority and be able to make that difference that we need to for our communities. We are on the edge of our ability to deliver for them. And the Conservative administration, despite the fact that it's a Conservative administration here in Medway, it's a Conservative administration there at Westminster, can see those frustrations. They're just not shouting about it as loudly as perhaps we would be, but they are equally as frustrated about their inability to be able to make that change. So I think for me, this isn't about those. I certainly think we would do things differently. I certainly think our decision making would be different. I certainly think our priorities would be different, but actually it's about that structural change, which I think, whether they like to admit it or not, could potentially benefit all parties. I would say that, yes, if you start to play politics with it, and I do think there is a slight sort of fear amongst Conservative politicians that any devolution deal would probably be worse off for them politically because of how they perform sometimes at a local level. So I do think that may well kind of colour how they make their judgments on this, but I equally believe that they do recognise the benefits of being able to have that greater autonomy in your local area.
Right, thanks, Nasha. Jamie.
The way this debate is shaping, and what I'm seeing, not just here, but around everywhere in the Labour Party, is we're all in agreement that we need to do something like this. And the question is becoming how. And there's a great T.S. Eliot quote where he says, people are dreaming of systems so perfect that nobody has to be good. And that's exactly the land we're in here. And this is where it comes down to. Do I think we should devolve it to areas where there are Tories? Yes, actually, because if you believe in democracy, you've got to trust that when, exactly as Nash has been saying, that when those local things actually come into the microscope and they're not hidden through the national lens, that you get a significant nudging of local people. I've had a Tory in my cabinet, because we don't get a choice of who's in our cabinet, telling me that we need to do more to support local businesses and national governments leaving them behind. I've had conversations with Metro mayors complaining about some of their cabinet ministers and the terrible decisions they're making, because when you're accountable to the people, you actually face a different pressure. So that is the big advantage of actually devolving power to the area where it's implemented, is that people can see it. It strengthens democracy. And whether that would nudge some Tories or whether we'd start to win in those areas, that would be great. And let's not pretend that Labour gets everything right all the time, or will get everything right all the time. We're human. So I really think we do have to devolve this and leave it to the electorate if we believe in democracy.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Tracy.
Yeah, I mean, it's a full set here. We're all in agreement that actually, if we believe in democracy, it is about then going to the voters with our offer and for them to choose. But certainly, I really understand what you were saying, Nusha, about, well, we're just waiting for government, because I believe that mayors should not be the ones just going to government with our hands out. What we should be doing is building a sustainable economic model for our community with inward investment, international investment, with that community wealth building and that procurement that we keep for me, you know, the West Yorkshire pound in West Yorkshire, and to support businesses to tender for services and to flourish. So that we can stand on our own 2 feet. And of course, where services are delivered by government, we want our fair share of the budget to do that. But also we're not going to stand by and just wait for government to help us out. We want to lead from the front and to be innovative and to be exciting economically. And certainly I'm glad that we brought a bit of art, Jamie, into the discussion and with a bit of poetry there. But also the idea that that we wait for the Conservatives to just help us out is not an exciting, positive model that certainly I want. But it is frustrating, I must say, when we have Conservative councillors saying that we must attack Labour's cuts to the police, and your head almost blows off, doesn't it? Because it's like, I can't believe you're even saying that in public. But democracy is about giving the people the choice, and we have to live with it, but also offer something better so that they come to Labour.
Excellent. Three excellent answers. And just to make one quick point, as I used to say in my union days to members, that don't spend our lives looking upwards with a crick in our neck, waiting for others to do it for us. It's how we get control and shape our own destiny and make a difference. And what the three of you have done today is to demonstrate outstanding Labour leadership, determined to make a difference, even in the most difficult of circumstances. So first, thanks to Jamie, to Tracy and to Nasha for three first-class and truly inspiring contributions. Secondly, our thanks to Rachel. The Constitutional Convention is a landmark for Labour going forward at the next stages. And in Rachel, we have somebody who is steeped in devolution and in power for ordinary people over their lives. And this debate will be therefore absolutely critical at the next stages. Thirdly, our thanks to John and the English Labour Network for bravely embarking down a path absolutely critical in its own right to the people we represent, but also if Labour is to rebuild and recover and ultimately form a government once again, then when it comes to writing the history of that, because it will happen, the English Labour Network and John Denham will have an honourable chapter in that history. And a final plug, if you don't mind, we have three excellent people here today, candidates for Labour. We have also the contest for Metro Mayor in the West Midlands. I'm chairing Liam Byrne's campaign. He, like Jamie, Tracy and Nasha, is truly outstanding. And we are utterly determined that what we are going to do is to turn the blue tide and start to rebuild the red wall. So it's been a first-class start to this conference. Thank you all so much. I'm going to hand back now to Jonathan to brief on the